Hello, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World Talks. The 2-hour-long phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine not only failed to bring any breakthrough in peace process, but also seems to have seriously worried Washington's European allies. But what is the American perspective? And is Donald Trump still willing to seek peace in Ukraine at all? To discuss it, we're joined by Professor Scott Lucas from the University College Dublin, who specializes in American and international politics. Good evening.
Very good evening to you.
So Donald Trump says Kiev should discuss peace terms directly with Moscow. Is the US slowly moving away from the negotiating table?
I think to answer that question, you have to look at Donald Trump, and then you have to look at his administration. When you talk about Donald Trump, your viewers will know this already. You have a very unpredictable, almost chaotic man who simply wants to be flattered and simply wants the photo opportunity of being a supposed peacemaker. So when at the end of April, you finally get a one-on-one meeting between him and Vladimir Zalinsky is able to win him over to an extent. When, however, the Kremlin decides that they need to get back the initiative, or at least push back the ideas of a ceasefire, then they set up this call with Vladimir Putin. Putin works on him for 2 hours, and then Trump is no longer talking about a ceasefire. He's talking about Russia and Ukraine having these talks that of course will succeed. So, this is not a president in the sense of someone who is coherent, someone who is actually effective. You have officials in the Trump administration, however, and they take up different positions, which determines where we go next in this conflict. Now, some of those advisors, like the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, the envoy to Russia, they're very pro-Kremlin. They effectively will accept the Kremlin's terms, including taking over about 25% of Ukraine. You have other advisors like Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, however, who believe that you cannot simply just support Vladimir Putin's demands. Indeed, you have to talk to Ukraine and the Europeans about what is needed for Ukraine's defense. And then you have officials in between those, like the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's playing both sides. So on the one hand, he says today, we can't put more sanctions on Russia, else they won't negotiate. On the other hand, we have to find more Patriot anti-air defense systems to help Ukraine against the ongoing Russian missile and drone attacks.
Maybe then someone else should try to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. Pope Leo.
Well, Pope Leo certainly has offered the Vatican as a site for negotiations, for talks. But let me get back to a fundamental here. You can't mediate talks for a negotiated settlement if one side does not want a negotiated settlement. And the fundamental here that we must emphasize is that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin do not want a negotiated settlement. They want Ukraine's capitulation. Just look at what Putin said yesterday after the call with Trump. And the Kremlin, interestingly enough, was first to get their message out before Trump did on social media. The Kremlin said two things that are significant. First, no ceasefire, no 30-day ceasefire, no ceasefire of any kind. There first has to be all these arrangements with Ukraine. And after these arrangements are done, then we stop attacking. But secondly, what are those arrangements? And here Putin uses his shorthand phrase. The main thing is to eliminate the root causes of the conflict. Now, when Putin uses the phrase eliminate the root causes of the conflict, he means the ultimata to Ukraine, which include giving up 4 regions, Zaporizhia, Kherson in the south, Donetsk, Luhansk in the east, as well as the Crimea Peninsula, Ukraine being neutralized, demilitarized, and with no strong security guarantees from the West, sanctions lifted on Russia, and even possibly the demand for the removal of the Zalinsky government. That's what the Kremlin is pushing for, their maximum demands, and they're still pushing for it. So there is no room to negotiate, as Zalinsky has pointed out time and again, even as he and Europe say that they are ready to go into talks to try to get a ceasefire.
But does Donald Trump understand it? Here's the question, because he seemed genuinely happy after his conversation with Vladimir Putin, and I'm just wondering, how is it serving the U.S. interests?
First of all, Donald Trump doesn't think about U.S. national interest. Donald Trump thinks about Donald Trump's interest. You know, the shorthand for this is he's a transactional president. But he's not that well informed. Axios, the website, on the basis of sources who were, quote, close to the talks, had a telling story. And that is, when Donald Trump spoke after his conversation with Vladimir Putin, he had a brief call with Vladimir Zalinsky and with European leaders, such as Emmanuel Macron, such as Ursula von der Leyen. Trump said, Putin is proposing to begin the peace talks. And everybody was kind of stunned because they had to remind Trump that there had been, quote, peace talks only a few days earlier in Istanbul, and Putin hadn't shown up. You know, Trump, in other words, he's got certain smarts. He's a very, very effective street politician to get where he is, but that doesn't mean he has a grasp on the issues. And when he talks to Vladimir Putin runs rings around him, not only in terms of knowledge, but in terms of manipulating what Trump thinks about the situation.
And Donald Trump also has American media backing him. And I'm wondering, which narrative wins, that of a diplomatic failure or that of diplomatic success?
In this way, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are the same, which is they just buy time. Vladimir Putin buys time so he can continue the missile and drone attacks. He continues the attacks on the front line in eastern Ukraine. And he tells the Russian people, we will triumph. And indeed, sources close to Putin this week went to the American outlet Bloomberg and said, Putin's not going to agree to a ceasefire because he thinks he can win by the end of the year. So, he buys time. Donald Trump buys time in that he's always saying, we'll get a deal, even if they're not closer to a deal. So indeed, if you want to play out where this goes next, Ukraine and Europe, and I think the Ukrainian-European relationship is actually the most important right now. Ukraine and Europe will maintain the demands for a ceasefire, and Europe will continue to try to bolster Ukraine's resistance. Now, if Putin cannot break that, he has one more card to play, whether it's a week from now, a few weeks from now, later in the summer, and that is a face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. And he and Trump can stand next to each other and say that they are seeking peace and they can buy some more time. All of which, if we want to cut to the chase, means we're not talking negotiated settlement here. We're not talking ceasefire here. We're talking about the position that we have been in for 39 months, which is, can you maintain Ukraine's resistance against the Russian military campaign, against its political campaign, and against its disinformation campaign, including the disinformation campaign that it wages through Donald Trump.
You mentioned this inner opposition within Donald Trump's administration against his actions. Well, I'm wondering, about the most hawkish part of the Republican Party, because they have already made efforts to push Donald Trump to impose more sanctions on Russia. So far, they've failed. Why?
Well, we're still just unbelievably, with how much has happened, we're still less than 4 months into the Trump administration. And it takes time to build up pressure on Trump. And of course, Congress is dealing with a whole series of issues right now, notably the massive budget and tax bill, which is still being debated. I think we're actually moving towards that pressure on Trump to put the sanctions on Russia. There are a significant number of senators, including a large number of Republicans in the Senate, who now favor increased sanctions on Russia. Indeed, Lindsey Graham, who is a friend of Trump, but also believes that Ukraine needs to be supported, he was in Istanbul last week pushing that idea that the U.S. can toughen sanctions. There are some within the administration who agree with him. There are some who do not. So we're not talking about necessarily the Republicans in the Senate getting their way. But I do think, in terms of what you say, this public presentation, that I think they can put pressure on Trump. They can put pressure on Trump, if not to put sanctions on Russia, to at least put some distance between himself and Vladimir Putin. It may not be enough to get the level of U.S. support that we want for Ukraine, but it's certainly better than Trump simply being in Putin's pocket.
Now, lastly, as well, you've already said it, but in terms of Putin's demands towards Kiev, though, I'm also wondering about the replacement of political leadership in Kiev from Donald Trump's perspective. Is he still holding a grudge against Vladimir Zalinsky over the infamous Biden Jr. case?
Yeah, I think the pressure on Zalinsky has decreased a bit in that direct way. You might remember, if we were talking back in January, February, Trump is calling Zalinsky a dictator. He's lying that Zalinsky has only 4% support. And then we have that horrible meeting in the White House on February 28th, where J.D. Vance, the vice president, ambushes Zalinsky. Now, Trump still will say Zalinsky started the war, started the Russian invasion. But after the meeting that Trump had with Zalinsky in the Vatican, where Zalinsky got that 15 minutes to say, no, look, we're the ones who are being attacked, he hasn't been as loud. And I think even more important is J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance met Vladimir Zalinsky, of course, a couple of days ago. And significantly, that meeting was a cordial one. I still don't think they're going to be friends, but they both put out very cordial statements after the meeting. And Vance is no longer taking that hard line, which is that the United States has to bail out completely on Ukraine's security and on Europe's security. So I think that's a signal that, as I was mentioning, within the administration, although there's these differences of opinion, I don't think the idea that the Americans are going to immediately line up with the Kremlin is where we are right now. I think the bigger risk right now is indecision and almost paralysis within the administration, in part because it's divided, and in part because Donald Trump simply is not a coherent leader, simply is not a leader of any kind. He's simply a follower, whether he's following Vladimir Zalinsky one day or, more often, following Vladimir Putin.
Professor Scott Lucas from the University College Dublin was our guest this evening. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thanks to you and your viewers.
And thank you, our viewers, for watching, and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.